Okay, thank you all for coming. I have the pleasure of welcoming and introducing the speaker today. I guess I will first start off by saying that Dr. Raghuram is here. I think as a favor to us, his wife is actually co-teaching a course with me on global mental health. I know I see some of our students here, Dr. Ahalya Raghuram. But Dr. Raghuram himself was actually my mentor in 2003 when I was doing my fieldwork in India. And we had actually met because I had cold emailed several people in the clinical psychology department at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences. And I think, Ahalya, you had referred me. She said, well, actually, my husband does a lot of work in cultural psychiatry if you want to meet him. And we met over the course of, I would say, about a year or two developing my proposal for my dissertation work, and ended up working at NIMHANS for about 6 months and spending a full year in India that year. And I have to say, honestly, that 6 months I spent at NIMHANS, National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore, really transformed my life. I wouldn't be here today in the Department of Global Health if it weren't for that experience of really immersing myself in this world of mental health in India and understanding the system. And it really was Dr. Raghuram who kind of opened my eyes from this very traditional clinical psychological training that I was getting to opening myself up to the humanities and anthropology and kind of infusing things and trying to understand my surroundings as well as myself a bit more as a Indian woman growing up in the U.S. So I really am very thankful to you for helping to shape my career. I'm also going to read his bio here, and it's a very lengthy paper here that describes all of the work that he's done. But Professor Ramanathan Raghuram is a well-known teacher and researcher in the field of psychiatry. He worked for over 2 decades there as a professor of psychiatry and the chairman of residency training programs at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences. And we learned actually through discussions today that NIMHANS actually trains about 55% of all the psychiatrists in India. And that's not even including the psychiatrists that have left, which are the majority outside and practice outside of the U.S. So they're quite a center for learning mental health in the country. And then after his time at NIMHANS, he spent 3.5 years in the United Arab Emirates to initiate a postgraduate residency program in psychiatry that was begun for the first time in that region. After this, he then moved back to Bangalore and is now working as a professor and head of the Department of Psychiatry at Kempe Gowda Institute of Medical Sciences in Bangalore. He also has many side projects related to mental health and some somewhat related to mental health, but he recently joined the Board of Governors for the World Association of Cultural Psychiatry, representing the South Asian region on that board. And he's the chairperson of the Task Force on Media and Mental Health for the Indian Psychiatric Society, which, by the way, if any of you are in Bangalore, I'm hearing that in January they're having their annual meeting at NIMHANS. So I am lucky enough to be planning a trip in January next year, so I'll hopefully be able to attend. His main interest is in cultural psychiatry, where he employed anthropological methods to examine cultural and contextual determinants of psychiatric problems. Historically, a Commonwealth Fellowship facilitated his tenure in the Department of Cultural Anthropology at the University of College London. He then went on to work as a WHO Fellow at the University of Toronto. And he was a consultant on the World Mental Health Report, which is actually one of the chapters we read for our Global Mental Health class by Deja Arlay and such. And that was basically a report produced by the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He was a visiting professor under the NIMHANS Fulbright Academic Initiative, which was initiating a cross-cultural exchange program between NIMHANS and the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. And he was also a coordinator for the ICD-10 field trials in India. He has over 50 research publications and chapters in books, and he officiates as a trustee in a non-governmental organization called PADAI, which is involved with the education of underprivileged children in rural India. Besides his academic involvements, Professor Raghuram is a nature enthusiast, and we're going to take him birding, I hope, this weekend. He is a bird watcher and has an abiding interest in the visual arts, as you will probably determine by his beautiful slides today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Deepa, for your warm introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. Exploring the psychosocial determinants of illness has had a long history in this particular university, especially in the Department of Psychiatry. One of the earliest research projects that was ever undertaken in this department was exploring the relationship between stressful life events and a range of illnesses, based on which the Holmes-Rahe scale for presumptive life events was developed, which is still in use. Especially in an era in which we are faced with increasing biologism, it's important for us to widen our clinical gaze and start paying attention to the socio-cultural determinants of a range of illnesses, including mental health problems. This particular aspect has been highlighted in a recent book by Jerome Cahan called Psychology's Ghosts. And I wish that some of you start reading the first chapter, in which he persuasively argues that cultural determinants of mental health problems is an area that has been neglected by researchers in the field. On this background, let me take you on a journey into the landscapes of the mind in India. When I talk about the landscapes of mind, I came across a very interesting publication which explored which talked about the mapping of the American mind. I wonder whether any one of you have come across this interesting piece of article that was written by Renfro et al. In 2008. This study was carried out in 500,000 subjects across various states in various regions in the United States of America to find out whether there is any geographical variation in the personality profile of American population. And importantly enough, he found that there are regional variations in the psychological characteristics across the United States. This one. I wonder whether you'll be agreeing with that. He found high levels of extraversion, neuroticism in the state of Washington. But when you venture into the Indian subcontinent, the landscape is much more complex. And some of you would have read this very interesting book by Diana Irk called India, A Sacred Geography, in which he comments that India is more than a map. It is a three-dimensional landscape linked by its storylines. India is a very interesting amalgamation of the past, the present, and the future. As you would see in this particular photograph, this in fact is an astrologer who has positioned himself just beneath a Xerox shop, and this shop is adjacent to a hospital. And not surprisingly, many patients who consulted the hospital first prefer to meet him and take his opinion before meeting the doctor. Perhaps this consultation might be more beneficial to the patient than the medical encounter itself. So when I view the Indian context in terms of its cultural structure, the metaphor that comes to my mind is one of palimpsest. As you're aware, palimpsest is a parchment on which several inscriptions had been made after earlier ones had been erased. The characteristic of the palimpsest is that despite such erasures, there are always traces of previous inscriptions. Any cultural experience itself is an accretion of many layers. So when I try to unravel the palimpsest, that is the Indian culture, what we also notice that each and every day in our lives, we are enveloped in this degree of palimpsest in our daily lives. As walking through any streets in India would reveal, this is a photograph of the different posters that adorn our city walls. When I try to unravel the palimpsest of the culture that envelops us, let me start on a very personal note and talk about my own background. The language in which I am speaking to you today is not the language that we speak at home. It is not the language that was taught to us in our school for a long time. It is not the language that is spoken by majority of my fellow countrymen. We were introduced into this language thanks to Lord Macaulay. Lord Macaulay said, "We need a class of interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions, in morals and in intellect." Thanks to Lord Macaulay, English education was introduced into the country, and many aspiring students had their formal education in various colleges in the country, and the issue came up when they wanted to pursue their interest in the field of psychiatry. Prior to independence, there was no higher center of learning in the field of psychiatry in the country. So many of them who wanted to pursue that higher training in psychiatry went over to United Kingdom, because much of the training model in education was patterned after the United Kingdom. So once they had their higher training in psychiatry in the United Kingdom, the crucial issue was how relevant was this training when they came back to India. And this point was very poignantly pointed out by Dr. Surya. Dr. Surya is a very extraordinary figure in the Indian psychiatry. He was the foremost of cultural psychiatrists in the country. When he came back to India after his formal training in the United Kingdom, he wrote, "My basic medical training was in British India. My medical practice was in United Kingdom. When I returned to India, I was faced with Indian psychiatric practice. Many of the concepts I learnt abroad seemed to make little impact. After considerable introspection within myself, I located the difficulty. I was an Indian facing an Indian patient and Indian situations. But in dealing with this, I was applying totally different value systems, alien to both myself as well as to the patients whom I am seeing. This alienation manifested in peculiar ways. As to what I would call as the psychiatrization of native discourse, which manifested itself in examining of sexual practices. Why I want to draw attention to that is, this led to the formulation of what was even now considered as a culture-bound syndrome, which goes by the name of Dart syndrome. In Dart syndrome, people notice that there are patients who present with symptoms of weakness and lassitude, and they relate these symptoms of weakness and lassitude to concerns about loss of seminal fluid through nocturnal emissions. And this was categorized as a culture-bound syndrome, and quite a lot of research effect has gone into it to delineate that it is a distinctly different presentation of illness confined to the Indian subcontinent. Valorization of seminal fluid in indigenous traditional systems of medicine still exists. Semen is considered as a precious entity which needs to be conserved, and frequent excessive loss can lead to ill health. And this position is outlined in the Ayurvedic tradition, based on which the clinicians felt that any patient who place undue emphasis on the loss of seminal fluid is deemed to have a psychiatric condition. So the traditional view was that semen loss can cause sickness, and that is outlined in Ayurvedic texts. But the psychiatric perspective took a totally different view on that. The belief that semen loss can cause sickness is itself a sickness. So that is a totally diametric perspective, which really took a turn about a different interpretation of what was outlined in the ancient Indian texts. The whole question is, categorizing as a particular belief as a psychiatric condition, does it help in the management of the disorder? As Gurmeet Singh commented in an article in 1985, he said that these patients who complain of semen loss were not satisfied with our explanations to counter their belief that semen loss was harmful and that their symptoms were due to excessive worrying about it. It seems extremely naive to believe that after telling a patient that he is not suffering from the illness for which he has come, we should expect him to take treatment for an illness which he does not even believe it exists. So what this illustration really drives home the point is that it takes a long time. There is a widening gap between the culture of psychiatry and the culture of laity. And this gap has only widened over the course of time, especially in the last decade, because there is a widening gap is because of the dramatic increase in psychiatric categories thanks to the advent of various classificatory systems, particularly the DSM. There has been 340% increase in categories over the past few decades. I am not sure as to what is the background for this dramatic increase in categories, which has never occurred in the history of psychiatry so far. So what we are faced with is what I would call as a culture of classification, a culture of classification that entraps us, in which we seem to be producing categories aplenty. And this is perhaps the agenda of DSM-5 conference. You can name a disorder and win a prize. Inadvertently, the makers of DSM seem to follow Chairman Mao's advice. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, even if few of them are weeds. But what this classificatory system and the exponential increase in categories also points out is a growing inequality between global frameworks and local understanding of diseases. As Lee, who is a very prominent worker in the field of cultural psychiatry, pointed out, by replacing native metaphors with experience distance jargon, and by unintentionally demolishing cultures, the imposition of universalizing categories may imperil illness negotiations on the one hand and curtail local healing practices on the other. And this is pertinent especially in the Indian context, where there is plethora of alternative systems of healing, as this roadside advertisement might give you an idea. A person advertising that he has experience in 34 years of astrology, palmistry, numerology, face reading, long life reading, and future, and he adds, "Don't worry, please contact Mr. Shivkumar." So, in the Indian context, there is a long tradition of alternate systems of healing. The question is there a scope for these alternate systems of healing in terms of addressing the needs of people with mental health problems? So about 10 years ago, spun by this, I undertook a research inquiry into traditional healing practices for severely mentally ill in a rural village in South India. And this study was conducted in a remote village which was considered to be a very backward place. It was a village in which, as you are aware, in India there is a very strong caste system. This is a village of the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes. And in that village there was a temple This temple was built over the place where a person who lived in this village for a long period of time was buried. During his period of time, this person was known to have healing powers, especially for people with various kinds of mental health problems. So a small shrine was built over the place where he is buried, and people from neighboring villages bring people with severe psychiatric illnesses to this particular place because they feel that it has healing powers. So we conducted a study which was published in the British Medical Journal in 2002, and we demonstrated that a mere stay in the temple had a positive impact on the BPRS scores. In this temple there were no rituals that are conducted. It was not a high caste temple, and people just came there and stayed in the temple because they had a belief that the deity had healing powers. So this result itself was an eye-opener for us, because many times when patients come and tell us that they have visited one temple or the other, as a clinician, you tend to feel that such kind of impact may be very negligible and it may not be quite effective too. So when we were visiting this temple and demonstrating and inquiring into the effect of the stay in temple on people with severe psychiatric illnesses, we also notice that in the same temple, every week on Friday, people come there for various kinds of possession rituals. So ritualistic possession was taking place in the same temple on a particular day in the week, that was Friday. And when I observed one of those occasions, as musicians played the drums, there was this girl who started to sway and fell into a trance. Her voice changed. She started speaking in a hoarse male-like voice, and she started demanding cigarettes and liquor. And she was saying, "You all think I'm weak? I'm a very powerful man. I will study and become very big and change the world. Everyone will fall at my feet and worship me." Slowly she began to swirl violently. It took 4 people to restrain her, and a few people fell at her feet too. Then suddenly she collapsed onto the floor with a cigarette dangling from her mouth. At the end, the priest calmed her down, cut a strand of her hair, wrapped it around a rusty nail, put it in a bottle, covered it and buried it in the temple premise. So this is what I observed in the temple presence, which is essentially a ritualistic possession act which is performed. So what I was also curious to find out was what is really happening in the life world of this particular girl. So we went, traced her out, and inquired as to what is the particular background, what is the story that she had beyond the ritualistic possession that we witnessed. So we traced her house, and this is her house, and we met her mother. And when we met her mother, a different story unfolded, a story of a very disturbed life world. The mother said that this particular girl who got possessed was a very good student, scoring very high marks. After she finished schooling, parents were trying for a match for her. They found a boy in a neighboring village who was uneducated. The patient was quite reluctant, but the parents persuaded her to marry her. The boy's family demanded 50,000 rupees as dowry. The girl's father sold his cattle, raised 30,000 rupees and gave it to the boy's family, promising that he would pay rest of the money later. On the wedding day, the boy's family demanded the balance amount. Though the girl's father pleaded with them to go ahead with the marriage and he would settle the amount within a week's time, the boy's family walked away. Unable to bear the loss of face, the girl's father committed suicide within a week. The girl was totally shattered by this incident and became withdrawn and silent. So the mother said that once she noticed this behavioral change, we took her to the doctor in the primary health center nearby. As she was not sleeping well, she ate less and lost weight. He gave her some pills, which were tricyclic antidepressants. Her sleep and appetite improved. We asked the doctor, why was she so dull and sad? He said that it was due to chemical changes in the brain, and that she should take the medicines for at least 6 months. We were extremely worried that if she was on medicines for this long, who will marry her? So we stopped the drug and took her to the temple. The priest told us that she was behaving this way because some unwanted spirit has entered her, and once the spirit was bottled, she felt much better and is studying well now. She got aid from the government to pursue her studies. We'll get her married when she finishes her studies. And she also added at the end that these things can happen to anybody. It's not an illness. So belief in spirit possession provided the family with a sense of agency, offered a space for socially accepted interventions, kept the person within the social group, and decreased the sense of blame or shame. And most importantly, it was perceived to be less stigmatizing. But these are narratives from the margin. In the sense, how could a biomedical perspective examine this phenomena or react to this phenomena? So we went and met this doctor in the PHC who gave her the antidepressants and asked him what he thought about this particular girl. So the doctor's account was that she was a classic case of depression, sir. What she needed was a good dose of antidepressants. I prescribed one, but she never came back. I heard that they took her to the temple. I don't know why in this scientific age people do such irrational things. It's all sheer drama. I am sure that she'll come back one day much worse. Now, this entire paradigm of chemical imbalance leaves the self out of the picture. Nosologies like dysthymia or depressions are sanitized and are culturally decontextualized in pursuit of an elusive universal truth. This kind of an account of human distress is virtually devoid of any social meanings, and most importantly, it's shorn of any kind of cultural significance, leading on to what I would call as an instance of cultural dyslexia, which leads on to a culture-blind psychiatric practice, which our nosologies and classifications seem to encourage. What we must remember is that the psychiatric perspective is just another layer on the country's ancient traditional palimpsest of viewing suffering. Nobody said it much better than our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. He said, India is an ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie has been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer has completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. So in terms of negotiating their illnesses, patients and their families don't see any contradiction between negotiating between the sacred and the secular, because they feel that it is quite complementary. They don't have any kind of a disjuncture in terms of their help seeking. But unfortunately, when it comes to the professionals, the psychiatrists seem to be trapped in a neo-Kreplinian straitjacket in which they seem to be endlessly hearing and favoring the repetition of various kinds of songs like schizophrenia, depression, which are seeming to be topping the charts. What I am concerned about it is whether nosologies like the DSM, including the DSM-5 that is going to come in, are privileging categories over contexts. And if we privilege categories out of context, we are losing the meaning of human distress, and we won't be able to address human suffering in any meaningful way. When I look at the kind of consultation that goes on into development of nosologies and endless hours that are spent in formulating categories, the words of T.S. Eliot in Wasteland comes to my mind. He wrote, and it is extremely apt for DSM makers, the endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment brings knowledge of words, but ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. As we unravel the palimpsest of human suffering as professionals, we are striving to bring newer and newer understanding to the distress that we are trying to work through. And the kind of answers that we are coming up, whether it is addressing the needs of our clients, is not really very certain. We are not very certain about it. Perhaps we need to ask in an increasingly complex world, sometimes old questions require new answers. Thank you very much. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very provocative, very interesting. What do you suggest as future directions? What do you suggest to the committee of DSM-5? Is it time to scrap the whole thing, go back to basics? There has been some discussion of trying to look at maybe in more behavioral ways some of the key components of psychiatric distress and get away from all the nosology, all the different categories. I wonder, where do you think we should go from here?
See, firstly, we'll have to pose ourselves a question. Whose need is DSM addressing? Is it addressing the needs of the professional or the consumers? Do the consumers want 340% increase in categories? What is the driving force behind this exponential increase in categories?
Insurance.
Pardon?
Insurance companies.
That is a cultural phenomenon.
Healthcare.
It is not a scientific quest.
Good point. It's not just insurance companies. You could talk about, kind of the professionals in the field. Okay, insurance companies benefit from the expansion of categories if you can demonstrate with the introduction of a new category that your medication is efficacious in treating one of the defined criteria there. But also, for instance, like researchers and the American Psychiatric Association benefit from continually bringing forward new criteria, new diagnoses to kind of get your name on a project that brings forward a new category of illness, introduced it successfully into the DSM-5. Is an extraordinary professional accomplishment. It brings money to the institutions that train. That keeps the doors open in places like this and other places that kind of be on the leading edge of this research.
Yeah.
Does it parallel, do you think, like the kind of situation in the broader field of medicine now? Is there not kind of a similar kind of process of specifying in more detail, being able to identify more narrowly different types of syndromes and illnesses, tying them with different, particular pathological markers and things? The argument could be made on the other side that it's just a natural process of advancing psychiatric science that the new categories kind of come forward, the new illnesses, shades and nuances of them evolve as we kind of have better techniques and instruments.
See, this increase in categories is based on empirical evidence. Then your supposition that it is a scientific enterprise might have some value. But many of these categories are just decided by experts sitting around. And secondly, this increase in categories is also reflective of what I would call as the industrialization of the profession. In terms of marketing a commodity for which you will find that there are many takers, and you also benefit in the end by promoting that particular product. So it is indicative of the industrialization of mental health in one way. And thirdly, no other branch of medicine has seen this exponential increase in categories in the last decade. Why psychiatry has done it? No other branch of medicine has had 340% increase in diagnosis. Where was the need in psychiatry to do that? Yeah.
That from a little bit. I mean, so I've been a psychiatrist for just 2 years now, and I feel like already I frequently see patients where, you know, I look at this patient and I say the thing that I used to treat the last patient who looked somewhat like this isn't working now. How do I tell that what worked last time isn't going to work for this person? And how do I recognize, you know, the patient where another treatment's going to work better? And that's a compelling clinical need. It makes me think, you know, what can I recognize the next time? What's different? What's a different pattern that can help me help these people more quickly and more effectively? And I think that that's a compelling reason to sort of start doing these conversations. And the DSM has been sort of misused for many different purposes, but in DSM-3, since it's, you know, bursting into prominence, that's its original biggest role is to help create patterns that we think might be relevant to predicting outcome and treatment efficacy, and to allow us to test that as a community. And it sort of sounds like what you're talking about, you're describing almost categories of patterns that we're not able to capture very well in the way that DSM is written, because you're saying that sort of somebody's story might hold, and context might hold predictive information for how we can best help them, and that's not being captured in the DSM. But that doesn't necessarily sound like it's saying we shouldn't be trying to look for these kinds of patterns. It sounds like maybe you're saying we should be talking about them in a different language.
Yeah, seeking patterns is an essentially human activity. You and I are categorizing people every day. So that's not the issue. The issue is how far should you go in categorizing illnesses? And does mere categorizing of illness helps you in managing the patients? We have to go beyond diagnosis in terms of implementing a treatment plan to address suffering. And diagnosis is only one pointer for that management. If you want to particularize your management strategy to a client, you have to look beyond diagnosis. When you look beyond diagnosis, you look at the context of the suffering. And that will help you to address the individual suffering much better than the diagnostic label that you give. Sir.
I think you're also making the point that because there's so many cultures, there are many different conditions and potentially ways of treating them. The semen wasting condition, for example, that's probably not in the DSM-5, but it causes a great deal of anxiety in a sector of society that might be better treated with some sort of ritual than with tricyclic antidepressants. How do you end up sort of dealing with the huge number of cultures, though, and their appreciations of what is and is not healthy, and ultimately try to figure out specifically what might be the best? Ultimately, it's going to take a huge computer, it seems to me.
See, if you trace the history of this anxiety around semen loss and categorizing it as a psychiatric illness, you will find that the origins of it were in North America. Origins of this particular concern were in North America. It was in 18th century that people identified neurasthenia, and one of the common causes for neurasthenia at the time was supposed to be loss of semen. And this category has transformed himself in very many cultures in different phases and took a different shape. And semen loss is an idiom of distress, as it's a kind of an attribution to illness. Attributions to illness are always culturally shaped, and attributions of illness need not be categorized or pathologized. Attribution is different from distress. I can have weakness, and I can say that my weakness is due to very many causes, and these causes can be rooted on my own cultural beliefs. These attributions help me to manage a particular client. And if you start pathologizing those attribution, you'll pathologize cultures.
That's where the categorization expansion is
That's
concerning.
Sure? Yeah, I'll have.
Given what you're saying, that in the Indian culture there's a blend of traditional and biomedical, and that people go between both pretty easily. How do you train? Because I know you're training new psychiatrists in the field. How do you train them to be effective?
As I had mentioned, it is very, very difficult to train a professional to have a very flexible attitude between the sacred and the secular, because giving importance to the sacred domain is perceived to be very threatening to the professional scientific attitude of the particular person. See, in training, it is very difficult for us to integrate both these perspectives, because no training institute will allow that to happen. I am not aware of any training institute in the world which integrates this kind of a framework officially. But what really happens is, once a particular person finishes the training and actually enters the practice, he will be confronted with these kind of issues. And in handling those issues, he relearns, readapts his training to the requirements of his clients, even though he is not formally trained in these kind of issues during his formative years of residency. Sorry, you had something to say? Yeah?
Well, I agree with that. I think we train a lot of our trainees to work with people in other fields. And the traditional healers, they weren't broken up into the different professionals we have nowadays. You know, there's social worker for social health, there's the priest, the clergy, the religious, there's the provider for the physical, there's the psychological for the psychological. They were all within one healer. They weren't so segregated or separated. But I was going to say, what do you think is the role of nosology or classification in terms of the health of professionals? Is it very, very limited, or do you see any role that might be helpful at all?
Nosologies, of course, are helpful. See, let me state it very clearly. Nosologies are quite helpful in terms of identifying patterns of distress. But in helping those people with distress, you will have to go into, as I said, the explanatory framework that patients bring into their distress. But, as I said earlier, patterns of distress, if you want to exponentially increase it so far, they become absolutely meaningless. And we have to seriously question whether our consumers want it.
See, one of the kind of contrasts that Chris, when you talk about kind of the difficulty that psychiatry and other kind of biomedical based programs that give rise to DSM have in allowing these kind of explanatory systems, idioms of distress to kind of enter into or work if we're psychiatrists or psychologists on equal footing with the categories of DSM. You have the orientation of the whole discipline of psychology in particular kind of arising out of the studies of biology and chemistry and on the level of the kind of foundational sciences of kind of chemical reactions and things like that, where it's a secularized. These are very secularized disciplines that don't admit any possibility of kind of divine forces, ghosts reaching in and changing the likelihood that a chemical bond will be formed under certain circumstances in a test tube, when these elements are combined and bleed. So there's this very kind of rigid secularization of the kind of base science upon which psychiatry would see itself as founded. So then to admit the possibility of supernatural agents or explanations or things like that, kind of like into the frame on equal footing, it provokes a great deal of kind of anxiety and kind of problems for a lot of people who are doing this work. So it seems like what's going on with DSM is an attempt to create a kind of like a kind of secularized, almost like a periodic table of the elements, where you take people's stories about possession, for instance, and say, these are 20 different cultures that have 20 different stories about outside agents like ghosts or demons or something like that possessing people. But really what's going on here is there's a belief. And a belief is something that we can talk about, and we can keep it secular. These people have a belief in outside agencies who come in, influence their thinking, their mood, their feelings, and they can be efficaciously countered by a certain type of intervention or ritual. There's an attempt to kind of cast it all again into a secular language in DSM and in our treatments and things like this. But it does seem like you're kind of stripping away, as you say, kind of like the whole frame of meaning and the whole referencing frame and the way that people live their lives, which is many times in reference to a set of beliefs and in a world that where these are deeply meaningful experiences and entities, and they're not secularized. So to try and recast all this in secular language, kind of say that you've got a more basic type of treatment or diagnosis or patterning that you can apply worldwide, it does seem like that gets into very serious problems if you accept even those ground terms. That we're not going to talk about supernatural or anything outside of what can be documented material forces, for instance.
That's right. See, one of the important figures in American psychiatry, Adolph Meyer, said that psychiatric categories have to be seen in the context of a life world of the patient. I mean, he started viewing psychiatric categories as what he called as reactions in particular life trajectories, and he advocated a life chart approach so that the illness is seen in the context of the life world of that patient. My concern is that kind of a perspective is being slowly eroded in psychiatry. Illness cannot be seen in isolation of the particular life world of the client. And to what extent we can really give credence to that life world so that psychiatrists become sensitized to that and don't privilege categories over context. That is the major dilemma. You're quite right. I like the analogy that you drew between the periodic table and DSMs. Sorry? Let me give the chance. Yeah.
I was wondering how you envision potentially like treatment in psychiatry, like as far as like how this information might change like psychotherapy or any interventions into this.
Come again? I didn't.
How do you envision kind of cultural psychiatry informing how you practice psychotherapy or any sort of psychiatric intervention?
Right. See, any psychological intervention has to be based on explanatory frameworks. The explanatory frameworks which guide psychological intervention is usually favored in preference to the professional frameworks. We don't really take cognizance of the explanatory frameworks of the client. So cultural psychiatry would advocate an approach in which you elicit that explanatory framework, validate it to the extent that the client feels secure with that, do not really challenge that, and give him ways of coping with his distress which are in tune with his own explanatory framework.
So would you recommend somebody go to the astrologer sometimes?
You don't have to recommend, people go. See, there is another kind of a
You
myth.
ever read the horoscope in the paper? I mean, that's going to an astrologer, right? It's that simple. It's pervaded in our culture. It's in every major newspaper in the United States of America. And to distinguish that as something that's spiritual in a different country is loosely, I mean, it diminishes the very aspect that it has in our culture.
Thank you for saying that. See, because one of the myths is that opting for alternate or traditional systems of medicine or complementary systems of medicine is something very, very peculiar for so-called developing or third world countries. That's a myth. When they did a study in UK as to what kind of help-seeking people had in preference to their illness, they found out that the use of complementary medicine was much higher than professional medicine. So it's not something confined to third world countries. Sorry, Vince.
So I guess I wondered how you would bring together two things. So I really appreciate everything that you're saying. This has just been, thank you to Deepa for, this has been an outstanding talk. And I'm thinking both about what you're saying, like not, emphasizing categories over context, and then also thinking about some of the work that I do and Deb does around taking, evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy interventions to various cultures. And I was trying to put together what you were saying about making sure that you validate the client's framework for why the problem is happening. So I was wondering how you would think about some of the things we know can work cross-culturally, like changing the way people think about things so that they don't blame themselves, so that they, think about things that might have happened in a more helpful way. People that are depressed, getting them more active. So taking some of those strategies that work in a lot of different places, how would you link, or you would help us, I think about how to link some of these things that we know work with validating the client and the person's context of why it happened, but then link it to some of these strategies that we know work, or what would your recommendations be?
Yeah. See, what we found even in our work is when we did many of the research project using an instrument called the explanatory model interview catalog, which essentially elicited illness experiences, we found that inquiry into the explanatory frameworks and giving a space for the people to voice their explanations without, saying that it is irrational or not so meaningful, itself was therapeutic. You don't have to do anything else.
It's just the asking.
Because in conventional medical interview, such a space is not offered for the client. So giving him a space to narrate his own beliefs without really telling him that what your beliefs are totally irrational and unscientific, itself I feel is therapeutic.
Just the hearing and the listening.
She had her hand up
Sure,
for a long
sure.
time, I think.
I've heard about you mentioned Ayurvedic medicine in passing. Can you expand on that at all? Ayurvedic, because I know nothing.
Sorry, Ayurvedic medicine?
Ayurvedic medicine.
What is the question, sorry?
Can you speak to that?
About Ayurvedic medicine?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not so qualified to speak about it. What I said in reference to the categorization of that syndrome was that belief was anchored in Ayurvedic texts about semen and the potency of semen and consequences of semen loss is all outlined in ancient Ayurvedic texts. I won't be an expert to tell you more about Ayurveda.
Is there anything in the Ayurvedic text
About?
speak to psychiatry that you can?
Right. See, in Ayurvedic texts there is reference to severe psychiatric illnesses. I mean, people who have studied those descriptions feel that those descriptions fit in quite well with what would you and I would consider to be descriptions of schizophrenia. There are descriptions of psychiatric illnesses, but the other descriptions of depression, anxiety and all is not really prominent in Ayurvedic texts.
Just wanted to say one thing quickly is at Vinton's they actually recognize and practice side by side with Ayurvedic healers. Am I right? They have, if someone is known to be taking Ayurvedic medicines, they receive consultations from both Ayurvedic doctors and psychiatrists there.
If patients prefer, see there is an Ayurvedic unit, if patients prefer to take treatment, they can do that. And many times patients take the Ayurvedic treatment and also come over to the psychiatrist, take the prescriptions and take them together. Sorry? Yeah.
What about people who believe in theory about the biomedical perspective? And so, for example, they think, oh, I believe that mood disorders should be treated with medication. But the stigma is so high that they're not willing to identify as someone that suffers from that. So they're not seeking a traditional or religious or spiritual healing either, because they think if they had it, they would take medicine, but they don't have it. What do you do with someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, if your explanatory framework is privileging certain kinds of biomedical, theories, you would stick to medication and nothing more, and you would feel that addresses your need. But the basic questions you are asking is whether belief in biomedical perspective is more or less stigmatizing than other kind of explanations. What we found in our work is, as in this narration also, many times a biomedical explanation is much more stigmatizing than traditional expectations.
So what would you do if you had a patient that came to you that presented with symptoms of that categorized them as depressed or with some other psychiatric disorder, and they weren't seeking any help? How do you respect that without? Does that make sense?
See, you're talking about involuntary treatment?
I guess so. So I have a family member in India, and he has had symptoms of depression and what paranoia, and he's gone to the doctor, and they gave him medicine, but they don't talk about it. You know, they don't let anyone know about it, and now he's off his medicine and he's gone back into some of these old behaviors, but they've decided that he's not really bad, so they're not going to let him take medication anymore. And for me, it's so hard to watch because I think he should be getting something. And it's like end of conversation as far as they're concerned. So what do you do?
See, the need for intervention emerges from the client himself or from the caregivers. If both of them come to a consensual agreement in which they have adjusted to certain kind of dysfunction, there is no other scope for anybody else to intervene. Isn't it?
I'm sorry, what?
Pardon?
Can you repeat that?
See, the need for intervention emerges either from the client or from the caregivers, or in a large extent society at large, in the neighbors or whomever it could be from the community. If the patient and the caregivers consensually come to an agreement that the amount of dysfunction that he has doesn't require any intervention, who can really step in?
Seems like everybody's adjusting to it. It's almost like what you're saying is that, we always look at functionality before we diagnose, and the family is saying dysfunction.
Right.
So, in a sense, we can't even diagnose the person. So why treat the person, right? If everyone's adjusting. I'm not sure how long we have the room, but.
The board says until 3:50.
Oh.
Yeah, they get 2 hours.
Okay, then hey, we'll keep going. We can have some informal discussion afterwards too. There's a coffee.
Thank you